It all began the day the queen of the cul-de-sac decided she was in charge of everyone's business. The neighborhood was peaceful, tucked neatly on a quiet street where each house had the same manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and neat driveways. For years it had been calm, until she moved in. Her name was Deborah, though everyone quickly learned her preferred title, Karen. Karen arrived with a moving truck and a loud voice that echoed down the street before she even unloaded a single box. Within a week, she had stapled homemade flyers to the community mailbox titled Neighborhood Courtesy Rules, a document she claimed to have drafted on behalf of the non-existent HOA. There was no official homeowners association in that neighborhood, but she spoke as if she chaired one. At first, her self-appointed authority was almost laughable. She complained about lawn colors, mailbox heights, and even the sound of sprinklers at dawn. But soon, her fixation turned toward one specific target: the driveway next door. It wasn't long before she began eyeing it daily, measuring, pacing, and frowning at the painted lines that separated her property from her neighbors. The driveway belonged to a quiet resident who had lived there for years without conflict. It was an ordinary sloped stretch of concrete that connected to the street. Nothing remarkable about it. But to Karen, it was apparently a matter of community control. She started parking her silver SUV halfway across the boundary line, her tires often resting directly on her neighbor's side. When confronted politely, she waved it off, insisting that the street and any connected driveways were community property. According to her self-declared neighborhood ordinance, anyone could park wherever they liked, as long as she approved of it. At first, the neighbor ignored her. After all, reasoning with someone like that was like reasoning with a brick wall. But as weeks passed, the problem grew. Her car began blocking half the driveway regularly, making it nearly impossible to back out without precision turns. Sometimes she'd even angle it diagonally, as if daring someone to challenge her imaginary authority. Neighbors began to notice, whispering in disapproval. Some chuckled quietly from their porches, amused by the drama, while others kept their distance, afraid of becoming her next target. Karen, however, seemed oblivious. Or perhaps she thrived on the attention. Her control didn't stop there. She began patrolling the street with a clipboard, jotting down license plates, and sending passive-aggressive notes to anyone who dared park incorrectly. She'd slip them into mailboxes, written in neat cursive with phrases like, "Friendly," "Reminder," "Keep our neighborhood beautiful," or "You're in violation of community standards." No one took her seriously, but everyone dreaded her. Scrutiny. Then came the final straw. One morning, the neighbor woke to find her SUV completely blocking the driveway, nose to garage door, as if she had parked there intentionally to prove a point. There was no way out. It wasn't just rude anymore. It was obstruction. And this time, she had crossed a line. From behind her curtains, she stood proudly with her coffee mug, watching her neighbor fume. She believed she had won, that her authority had been solidified by sheer audacity. But what she didn't realize was that her little power trip had just set a chain of events into motion, one that would end with flashing lights, a tow truck, and her precious SUV disappearing down the street. For now, though the neighborhood simmered under her self-imposed rule, neighbors traded knowing looks as they passed her yard. The tension in the cul-de-sac thickened with each day she asserted her dominance. The neighbor, however, was patient, calm, observant, and quietly waiting for the right moment. Because sometimes revenge doesn't come with shouting or confrontation. Sometimes it comes with a simple phone call and a calm voice explaining the law. And while Karen spent her days enforcing imaginary rules, someone else was preparing to enforce real ones. The balance of control was about to shift. The queen of the cul-de-sac had reigned long enough, and soon her throne would be stripped away, one flashing tow truck at a time. By the next morning, word had spread quietly through the cul-de-sac. Karen had finally gone too far. Her SUV sat firmly across the neighbor's driveway, glinting in the sun like a monument to arrogance. It was an obstruction so blatant that no one could pretend it was accidental anymore. She had taken her so-called authority to a new level, declaring that the driveway, though clearly on her neighbor's property, was shared community space. She said it loudly enough for anyone walking their dog or checking the mail to hear. With each declaration, her confidence swelled, like she truly believed her fantasy of being an HOA enforcer. The neighbor, however, had stopped playing her game. He quietly documented everything. Photos of her car blocking access, timestamps, even a video showing the boundaries of the driveway and property lines. There was no need for confrontation. Not this time, because in the real world, there were actual laws that trumped Karen's imaginary ones. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around the neighborhood with her clipboard in hand, inspecting driveways, fences, and mailboxes as though she had been elected to the position. She left more of her infamous courtesy notices taped to doors, complete with her signature flourish at the bottom. Cho enforcement. Karen. Some of the newer residents even believed her at first, unsure whether she truly had authority. The neighbors' friends began whispering among themselves, wondering how long this could continue before someone snapped. Yet the neighbor remained calm. There was a certain power in silence, in watching someone dig their own grave, one bad decision at a time. Later that afternoon, Karen's SUV sat idling across the same driveway again, this time with the engine off and keys nowhere in sight. The neighbor had plans to leave for work, but her vehicle made that impossible. When confronted from a distance, she brushed off the situation, waving her hand dismissively and shouting something about community fairness. That was the moment the decision was made. The neighbor picked up the phone and calmly dialed the non-emergency city parking enforcement line. No yelling, no threats, just a clear, detailed report about a car illegally blocking private property and restricting driveway access. The dispatcher was polite but firm. A ticket officer would be dispatched shortly to assess the violation. For the next hour, the neighborhood hummed with anticipation. People peeked through blinds, pretending not to watch, yet unable to resist. Karen, oblivious to the coming reckoning, busied herself pruning her hedges and complaining to another resident about non-compliance and property standards. Then, the sound came. A distinct rumble, the low growl of a diesel engine rolling down the street. It wasn't a delivery truck. It was the city's parking enforcement vehicle, slowly making its way toward her SUV. The officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, assessing the situation with professional calm. Karen noticed too late. By the time she approached, the officer had already taken photographs of the obstruction, confirmed property boundaries, and begun writing a citation. Her tone immediately shifted from confident to panicked. She waved her arms, trying to argue her way out, pointing at imaginary community maps that existed only in her mind. But the law was clear, and the officer wasn't interested in debates. A driveway was private property. Parking across it, even partially, was a violation of municipal code. The fine was steep, and the next step, if the car wasn't moved, was towing. Karen fumed, pacing in circles, muttering about abuse of authority. But no one came to her defense. The same neighbors who once tolerated her lectures now stood silently by, their faces hidden behind curtains but their satisfaction unmistakable. Eventually, she moved her SUV, though not without dramatic revving and a few choice words to no one in particular. The street returned to calm, but the atmosphere had changed. The illusion of her power had cracked. For the first time, the neighborhood saw her not as a self-appointed enforcer, but as someone who could be held accountable. That night, she retreated into her house, blinds drawn tight. The neighbor, meanwhile, parked peacefully in his driveway again for the first time in weeks. The victory was quiet, but deeply satisfying. Yet if anyone thought this would be the end of Karen's crusade, they were mistaken. The warning had only wounded her pride, and pride was something she couldn't let go of easily. By the next morning, the flyers were back, this time in full color. Bold letters read, "Community Rights and Driveway Access Guidelines." Below it, a long paragraph twisted phrases from municipal codes into something entirely unrecognizable. She claimed the citation had been a misunderstanding and that she was working with the city to clarify driveway ownership rules. The neighbors laughed quietly among themselves, shaking their heads. But the neighbor who had made that phone call knew better than to underestimate her persistence. People like Karen didn't learn from embarrassment. They doubled down on it. And sure enough, within days, her SUV was back across the line. This time, though, she wouldn't be so lucky. Because while she was busy rewriting her fantasy HOA laws, the city's enforcement department was already keeping an eye on her license plate. The next time she parked there, it wouldn't just be a ticket waiting for her, it would be the tow truck. The morning after her parking citation, the street seemed to hold its breath. The faint tension that hung in the air was invisible, but everyone could feel it. The kind that follows after a storm, when the clouds haven't quite cleared yet. Karen's pride had taken a hit, but no one believed it would last. For a day or two, she behaved. Her silver SUV stayed neatly in her own driveway, parked perfectly within the lines as though she'd suddenly developed a respect for rules. The neighbors noticed the change, half expecting her to resume her self-appointed patrols at any moment. For the first time in months, the cul-de-sac felt normal, but calm was never her natural state. By the third day, she was back at it, pacing the sidewalks with her clipboard, pretending to take inspections. Her targets were always the same: trash cans left out too long, garden decorations that violated aesthetic standards, or lawns cut at uneven heights. Each offense was documented and noted for her imaginary records. And beneath that renewed sense of control, resentment simmered. She couldn't stand that the neighbor had gone over her head and called the city. To her, it wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about defiance. Someone had dared to challenge her fabricated authority, and she couldn't let that go. That resentment soon found its outlet. Late one afternoon, she began inching her SUV back toward the forbidden line. Slowly at first, like testing boundaries. The front tires crept a few inches past her property, resting on the neighbor's side. It was subtle enough that she could claim it was accidental, but deliberate enough to send a message. The neighbor noticed, of course. He didn't say a word. He simply took another photo, time-stamped and clear. By the next morning, her SUV had advanced further, now halfway across the driveway again, its presence deliberate and defiant. She had parked diagonally, just as before, as if reclaiming lost territory. When the neighbor's car had to be carefully maneuvered around the obstruction, she watched smugly from her porch, holding her coffee mug like a trophy. She believed the worst was behind her. After all, she had paid her fine, argued with the city over the ambiguity of property lines, and even mailed what she called a formal dispute letter to the code enforcement office. In her mind, that gave her immunity. But the truth was far simpler. She had just painted a target on herself. Because what Karen didn't know was that her previous citation hadn't been a one-time warning. The city's parking enforcement department had logged her license plate into their repeat offender system. Any future violations would trigger automatic escalation. That meant heavier fines, and if necessary, a tow. The next report would be her last. That day, as the sun dipped low, she parked in the same spot again, directly across the driveway. This time she didn't even bother pretending it was an accident. She parked, turned off the engine, and walked away confidently, clipboard under her arm. She even stopped to chat with another neighbor, loudly declaring that nobody owns the street, and that she was perfectly within her rights. The quiet observer next door made no response. Instead, another call went out. Calm, polite, and factual. The same voice, the same city line, the same simple report. A vehicle is blocking private driveway access. Only this time, the dispatcher didn't say they'd send an officer to issue a ticket. This time the response was different. A tow order was filed. For the next 2 hours, the street remained eerily calm. Karen went about her evening chores, completely unaware of what was coming. The sun dipped below the horizon, and porch lights flickered on one by one. Then a low rumble filled the air once again. That same heavy diesel growl that had haunted her last time. But this time, it wasn't the code officer. It was the tow truck. Its headlights cast long shadows across the street as it slowed in front of her driveway. The operator stepped out, clipboard in hand, inspecting the SUV. Within minutes, he confirmed the violation, attached the steel hooks beneath the tires, and began tightening the winch. The SUV lifted smoothly, inch by inch, onto the flatbed. From her kitchen window, Karen spotted the flashing amber lights. Her jaw dropped. The sound of her front door swinging open echoed through the quiet night. She stormed out, waving her arms, shouting words no one could quite make out. But it didn't matter. The paperwork had already been processed. The violation was logged, and the tow was authorized. Nothing she said could undo it. The neighbors stood quietly at their windows, watching the scene unfold. Some felt a flicker of satisfaction, others disbelief. The self-proclaimed HOA enforcer, the ruler of the cul-de-sac, was finally facing the same accountability she had tried to impose on everyone else. As the truck pulled away, her SUV secured and her authority dismantled, Karen stood frozen in her driveway, powerless for the first time since she'd arrived. Her clipboard hung limp at her side. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that only comes when justice lands exactly where it should. Yet even then, she refused to see herself as the problem. In her mind, this was war, and she was the victim. The next morning, her wrath would return in full force. The neighborhood hadn't seen the last of her yet, because in Karen's world, consequences weren't lessons. They were invitations to fight harder. The morning after the tow was one that no one on the street would ever forget. The sun hadn't even fully risen when the peace shattered, the kind of quiet morning hum replaced by furious shouting that echoed from Karen's front porch. Her car was gone. Her precious silver SUV, the symbol of her authority, her pride, her constant tool of enforcement, had vanished overnight. For several long minutes she seemed frozen in disbelief, pacing her driveway as if expecting it to magically reappear. Then came the eruption. She stormed up and down the street, clipboard in hand, phone pressed tightly against her ear, ranting to anyone within earshot about illegal towing, government corruption, and neighborhood harassment. Her voice carried far and wide, cutting through the morning stillness like a siren. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains, silently watching. It was like witnessing a storm unravel, loud, chaotic, yet strangely satisfying. Karen was convinced the city had made a terrible mistake. She called the parking office repeatedly, demanding to speak to supervisors, insisting her car had been wrongfully taken from community property. When they calmly explained that her vehicle had been impeding private access and towed under municipal authority, she refused to accept it. To her, this wasn't about the law. It was personal. Someone in her community had betrayed her, and in her mind, there was only one possible suspect, the neighbor whose driveway she had blocked. By noon, her fury had shifted into something more organized. The flyers returned, this time thicker and more dramatic. She stapled them to mailboxes and lamp posts, each one titled in bold red font, "Urgent Community Alert. Property Dispute Under Review." The text beneath accused certain residents of abusing city channels to oppress their neighbors. She called for a neighborhood meeting, one that no one had asked for, to discuss driveway fairness and the misuse of public resources. Not a single person showed up. She sat in a lawn chair in her driveway with a folding table, papers neatly arranged, pretending to take attendance anyway. It would have been comical if not for the sheer intensity in her eyes. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was enraged. The humiliation of watching her car being towed in front of everyone had ignited something deeper, something obsessive. The neighbor she blamed, however, remained calm. He didn't respond to her flyers, didn't acknowledge her pointed glares, didn't even look her way when she muttered loud accusations as he mowed his lawn. Instead, he let her words fall into the void, because silence, once again, spoke louder than any argument ever could. But Karen mistook that silence for weakness. She began escalating. She started walking past his house multiple times a day, phone in hand, pretending to record evidence of property violations. She photographed his car, his mailbox, even his flower beds. She would stand at the edge of his lawn, narrating imaginary infractions under her breath. She also began spreading rumors, claiming the neighbor was friends with someone at the city and had used connections to have her car removed unfairly. She told anyone who would listen that she was preparing to take legal action. Most of the neighbors stopped answering her calls. A few politely nodded from a distance, trying to avoid confrontation. But others had reached their limit. The whispered conversations among mailboxes grew louder, more unified. People were tired of her behavior, tired of the drama, the flyers, the hostility. Soon, Karen wasn't the only one contacting the city. Multiple complaints began to surface, this time about her. Reports described harassment, trespassing, and public disturbances. Her once tight grip on the neighborhood narrative was slipping through her fingers. Meanwhile, her SUV sat in the city impound lot, racking up storage fees with each passing day. When she finally went to retrieve it, she was met with another dose of reality. The total cost, towing, citation, and impound, was more than she had expected. The city workers treated her case like any other. Routine, by the book, emotionless. To them, she was just another violator who had broken the rules. She drove the car home days later, her face pale with quiet rage. The entire street noticed her return, but there was something different this time. A darkness, a determination. She parked her SUV perfectly in her driveway, at least for that day. But as night fell, her lights stayed on late. Through her front window, neighbors could see her pacing back and forth, her phone lighting up her face, her expression hard and calculating. Karen wasn't finished. In her mind, this was no longer about parking or property. It was about control. She had lost her car for a night, lost her image for a week, but in her eyes, she hadn't lost the war. Not yet. And soon she'd make sure everyone knew it, because if she couldn't rule through fear, she would rule through chaos. The next morning, something strange appeared on the neighbor's driveway, and that was when the true battle began. The following morning brought a heavy, uneasy silence to the cul-de-sac, the kind that always came before one of Karen's storms. The sun was still climbing when the first sign appeared. Right there, at the very edge of the neighbor's driveway, stood a small plastic cone, bright orange, reflective tape wrapped around its base, with a handwritten label taped to the top, "Community Zone, no parking." The neighborhood stopped and stared. It was unmistakably Karen's handwriting, that tight, looping cursive that had adorned countless flyers and fake citations. She had struck again. The neighbor didn't touch the cone. He simply stared at it for a moment, took a photo for his growing collection of evidence, and went about his morning. But the act was unmistakable. It wasn't just petty. It was symbolic. Karen was staking her claim once again. Within hours, more cones appeared. 2 on the street curb, 1 near the shared property line. A laminated sheet hung on a wooden stake that read, "Community Enforcement Area, managed by Neighborhood Authority." There was no authority, of course. There was no HOA, no association, no governing body. Just Karen, clinging desperately to the illusion that she was still in control. Her mission had shifted from rules to revenge. She wanted the neighbor humiliated the way she had been. She wanted the power dynamic restored, the one where she could intimidate with notes and threats, and others would quietly comply. But this time, the neighborhood wasn't afraid. By midday, several residents had already called the city's non-emergency line to report the fake community signage. A few even documented her activities, the way she patrolled the street, measuring tape in hand, muttering about driveway expansion violations and shared property easements. Meanwhile, Karen's anger seemed to grow by the hour. She began pacing the sidewalk directly in front of the neighbor's house, making exaggerated phone calls about unauthorized construction and safety concerns. She didn't care who was watching. She wanted everyone to know she was fighting back. The neighbor, patient as ever, refused to react. He simply kept collecting evidence, photos of the cones, the signs, and even short clips of her standing on the edge of his property line. He knew that while she operated on emotion, he was operating on fact. That afternoon, a city vehicle returned to the street, this time not for parking enforcement, but for code inspection. Someone from the department had been assigned to check reports about unauthorized signage and community disputes. When Karen saw the official step out, clipboard in hand, her expression shifted from confidence to confusion. She hurried to intercept him before he could even reach the cones. From her porch, she launched into another performance, explaining that she was acting on behalf of the community to maintain order. She gestured toward the cones and signs proudly, as if unveiling her latest achievement. The officer listened patiently, pen poised above the page, nodding occasionally. Then he asked a simple question. Who had authorized her to install any of it? The silence that followed was deafening. The truth, of course, was no one. Her authority existed only in her mind. And within minutes, the officer had issued her a written notice: immediate removal of all signage and cones, under penalty of fine. Karen's face drained of color. She tried to argue as always, but the officer had already turned to document the scene with photographs of his own. There was no debate to be had. Her entire operation was being dismantled. Officially this time. Neighbors watched as she reluctantly removed the cones, one by one, her movements jerky and angry. Each one felt like a symbol of her fading control. By the time she tore down the laminated community zone sign, the air around her practically vibrated with frustration. She muttered to herself the entire time, blaming the neighbor, the city, even the postal service for enabling harassment. And yet, even in her fury, she seemed incapable of learning, because that night, long after the streetlights came on and the neighborhood had gone quiet, she made her final mistake. She parked her SUV, the very same one that had been towed, directly across the neighbor's driveway again. This time, she positioned it perfectly, nose to garage door, blocking the entrance completely. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't ignorance. It was defiance. She believed that doing it under cover of darkness would give her time to move it in the morning before anyone noticed. But cameras, both security and doorbell, don't sleep. And that simple act, that one last assertion of power, would become her downfall. Because when the neighbor awoke and saw the blocked driveway once more, he didn't hesitate. The photos were sent. The video was attached. The report was filed. And this time, there would be no warning, no second chance, and no mercy. The city had already classified her as a repeat offender. And repeat offenders didn't just get fines. They got towed. Again. The final morning began quietly, deceptively calm, the kind of stillness that blankets a neighborhood before the sound of justice breaks through. Dew shimmered on the lawns, birds chirped faintly, and not a soul stirred in the cul-de-sac. Except one. Karen's silver SUV sat smugly across the neighbor's driveway again, gleaming beneath the early sun like an unwanted monument. Its presence was bold, deliberate, and defiant. A final act of control from someone who had lost all real power. But what Karen didn't know was that her fate had already been sealed hours earlier. The report had gone through the night before, complete with photo and video evidence. And when the city dispatchers saw her license plate, a note flashed across their screen. Repeat offender, immediate tow authorized. There would be no ticket this time. No warning, no conversation, just consequence. By mid-morning, the sound returned, that deep, unmistakable rumble of a diesel engine approaching from down the street. The tow truck. Again. It rolled slowly past the line of houses, sunlight glinting off its steel frame. The few neighbors who were outside paused what they were doing. They knew the sound by now. Some exchanged glances. Others simply smiled quietly. The truck stopped in front of Karen's house. The operator stepped out with a clipboard, checked the license plate, and nodded to himself. This was the one. Moments later, the metal chains clinked against the pavement as he crouched beside the SUV. The hooks slid under the tires, the hydraulic lift hissed to life, and with a smooth motion, the vehicle began to rise once more. The same humiliating sight as before, repeated like a lesson unlearned. From inside her house, Karen's blinds snapped open. She appeared in the window, disbelief frozen on her face. Then chaos. The front door flew open, and she came rushing out, slippers on, hair disheveled, shouting at the tow operator. Her voice cracked from sheer outrage, the sound of disbelief and wounded pride colliding. But the operator was calm, professional, immune to her theatrics. He'd seen it all before. He pointed to the paperwork, the municipal authorization number printed in bold at the top. This wasn't a neighbor dispute. This was law. Karen tried everything. She claimed harassment, discrimination, corruption. She said she was working with city council and that her car was legally parked on community property. She even brought out her clipboard, thrusting it forward as if it proved something. The operator didn't even glance at it. Within minutes, the SUV was secured on the flatbed once again. The truck idled for a moment as he double-checked the straps, then shifted into gear. The vehicle lurched forward, carrying away not just her car, but her illusion of power. As it disappeared down the street, the neighborhood seemed to exhale in unison. Curtains fluttered as people peeked out, unable to resist the sight. Someone on the corner quietly clapped. Another neighbor snapped a photo, more for memory than mockery. Karen stood there long after the truck was gone, clipboard hanging loosely at her side, her voice hoarse from shouting. The silence that followed was different this time, heavier, final, because she knew there would be no recovering from this. Not in that neighborhood, not after everything. Later that day, a city official arrived, not to tow, but to warn. Multiple complaints had been filed about her harassment, her signage, and her behavior toward other residents. She was issued a formal notice. Any further disturbance would be treated as harassment and trespassing. The line had been drawn, this time in ink that couldn't be erased. The next few weeks brought something the neighborhood hadn't felt in a long time: peace. No flyers, no notes, no surveillance walks or courtesy inspections. Karen's house stayed quiet, blinds always drawn, her car nowhere to be seen for days. The lawns grew greener, the driveways cleared, the laughter of children returned to the sidewalks. The air itself felt lighter. The neighbor who had endured it all, the one whose patience had quietly outlasted her fury, went about his life without a word. He never gloated, never bragged, never even mentioned her name again. He didn't have to. The street told the story for him, and Karen? Eventually, the "For Sale" sign appeared in her yard, bold, white, and freshly planted into the earth like a quiet surrender. She stayed inside during showings, her once commanding voice reduced to whispers behind the glass. The self-proclaimed HOA enforcer of a neighborhood that never had an HOA was finally packing up her empire of imaginary rules. The day the moving truck arrived, no one came out to say goodbye. The only sound was the wind through the trees and the soft hum of relief settling over the cul-de-sac. As her SUV, now safely back in her possession, rolled out of the neighborhood for the last time, the residents stood a little taller, breathed a little easier. The queen of the cul-de-sac had finally been dethroned, not by confrontation, not by anger, but by the quiet, unshakable force of patience and law. And as the neighbor pulled into his newly liberated driveway that evening, the faint sound of distant traffic and a soft sunset filled the air. Peace, at long last, had returned.